I'll see you soon.
Final Destination, Dead Man's Hand, Chapter 14. It was more like 4 hours, and then it was only to walk from the holding cell to a drab interrogation room on the second floor. That's where it was explained to Tom that he had to undergo another round of questioning, this time with some short-tempered FBI agent named Hotz and his silent partner. Hotz looked like he was about to have a stroke by the time he sat down with Tom in the interrogation room. His face was so red the top of his bald head almost resembled the flashing light on top of a police car. Tom had to cover his mouth to hide the smile that was forming, because there was only one thing he could think of that could make someone that flustered. Allie. "All right, Mr. Gaines," Hotz began. "Despite my best efforts to make clear to your wife just how much trouble she's facing, she apparently refuses to change her ridiculous story." Tom bit his bottom lip to stifle the laugh that was trying to force its way out. That was his girl, all right, stubborn to a fault. Back her into a corner, and she was only going to get even more stubborn. "So let's see if you and I can do better," Hotz concluded. "I certainly am willing to try," Tom said pleasantly. "By the way, where's my wife?" "I believe they moved her down to Holden," Hotz replied. "Detective Montoya is getting her something to eat." He paused. "Would you care for some food? Coffee, perhaps?" "I'm good," Tom said. "I'll get something when we get out of here." He raised a quizzical eyebrow. "Do you know when that might be?" "You're talking about being released?" Hotz smiled. It was a neat trick, Tom thought, the way the guy could find the perfect balance of bared teeth that made him look both friendly and menacing. "Well, there's nothing to release you from, Mr. Gaines. Neither of you have been formally charged with any crimes." Tom pushed his chair back from the table and stood up. "Then you mean we're free to go?" He glanced over to the other agents in the room. Hotz's partner and a blonde woman in charge of a video camera. "I could walk out of here right now and you wouldn't try to stop me?" From the stone-faced expression they both presented, it was pretty clear Tom wouldn't get more than 2 steps toward the door before they'd knock him on his ass and cuff him to the chair. "In a manner of speaking, yes, you could," Hotz replied. Tom turned back to face him. That pit-bull grin was still bolted onto the man's jowls. "Trust me, Mr. Gaines, I know exactly how anxious you are to leave. It's quite understandable. Were I in your position, I wouldn't want to hang around a police station answering questions for hours on end either. Especially not after going through such a traumatic experience as you did last night. But we're hoping you can answer just a few more questions before you do." He gestured towards Tom's chair. "Please." Tom stared at him for a moment, then at the other agents. He sighed and dropped heavily into the seat. "Fine," he said huffily. "But didn't you people already read the statement that I gave the detectives?" "I did, and it was very helpful," Hotz said. "But I'd like to hear it for myself. You know how it can be when something's written down. There's always the chance some comments can be taken out of context." Tom switched on his own false smile. "Oh, like back after 9/11, like all that weapons of mass destruction talk before the invasion?" Hotz's short, mirthless laugh sounded like a cat with consumption trying to cough up a hairball. "Oh, that's right," he said with a nod. "You voted Democrat in the last election, didn't you?" He sighed and looked at Tom with a bored expression. "Have a little problem with the way your government does business, Mr. Gaines?" "My government?" Tom said, slightly amused. "No, just with some of the people running it." "Well, maybe you'll do better next time round," Hotz said dryly. He turned to the female agent and nodded. She flicked a switch on the video camera to start recording the session. Hotz then opened a black leather folder that lay on the table by his left hand and began thumbing through a thin stack of reports. He selected one and took a few seconds to read over it. Tom recognized the handwriting on it as his own. It was his written statement. "All right," Hotz began. "Now, according to what you told the police, you and your wife were taking the elevator down to your room on the 25th floor, Tom answered. Hotz nodded without looking up from the paper. "Right. And had she exhibited any sort of unusual behavior while you were dining?" Tom stared at him for a few seconds, aware of how confused this expression must appear to the agent. "Unusual? Like what?" "Oh, I don't know," Hotz replied. "Was she acting nervous or jittery? Did she seem short of breath? Did she seem distracted at any point? Like her mind was on something else? That kind of thing?" Tom shook his head. "No." "Was she constantly looking around or at her watch?" "Well, I know she kept looking over at Detective Ackerman every now and then," Tom admitted. Hotz looked up, suddenly showing a definite interest. "Oh! Do you think she recognized him as a police officer?" Another headshake. "Nah, she thought he was some creep verbally abusing his girlfriend." "And what gave her that impression?" "'Cause the girl was crying," Tom smiled. "Allie doesn't care much for jackass boyfriends. Makes her start acting like an overprotective big sister sometimes." He shrugged. "Anyway, we didn't even know he was a cop until he identified himself in the elevator." "After your wife," Hotz paused to consult the report again, "freaked out, as you put it?" Yeah," Tom winced. Had he really been stupid enough to write that down? It made it sound like Allie acted like a nut job. Well, if he were lucky, she'd never find out about her husband's poor choice of words. "And did your wife exhibit any unusual behavior once you got on that elevator?" Tom had to think about it for a moment. "I'm not sure," he had to admit. "I mean, we got on and moved to the back so we could look out the windows, but as soon as we got there, she kind of blanked out." "Blanked out?" Hotz asked. "Could you elaborate on that?" "Well, she just..." Tom pinwheeled his hands, trying to come up with the proper description. He failed. "Just blanked out. Her eyes got real big." He widened his own, imitating the wall-eyed expression he'd seen on his wife's face. "You know, and she kind of just froze up and started staring into space." "Did she say anything?" Hotz asked. "Do anything?" "No, she just stood there not saying a word," Tom explained, "until that guy, Plug, bumped into her. That's when she started, freaking out," Hotz concluded. "Yeah," Tom said sheepishly. "Maybe it was some kind of signal," McGavin suddenly remarked. Tom almost jumped out of his chair. The agent had been standing so quietly for such a long period of time. He'd started to think the guy was a department store dummy instead of a real person. Hotz grunted. "Plug nudges Gaines to let her know it's time to put the plan into motion?" "What the hell are you talking about?" Tom demanded. "Are you trying to say my wife was part of some conspiracy to crash the elevator?" Hotz shot him a warning glance. "Calm yourself, Mr. Gaines. Agent McGavin was merely voicing a hypothesis." "Based on what?" Tom shot back. "That you think Allie might be some kind of terrorist?" "Terrorist?" Hotz eyed him suspiciously. "I never used that word, Mr. Gaines. What made you think of it just now?" "Because that's what you're here looking for, isn't it?" Tom replied. "Like, you're already sure the elevator didn't fall off the building because of some mechanical problem? So, like, there had to be somebody responsible? And since Allie's the only one who tried to warn us about it, and she's the, only one the cops got their eye on, it only makes sense you'd be, looking at her as a terrorist." He paused to take a breath. "Besides," he added in a more subdued tone, I overheard the detectives talking about it. He threw his hands up in the air. Jesus Christ, man, this is nuts. We never even met Plug until we got on the goddamn elevator. We only came here to do some gambling and check out the sights, man. And whose idea was it? Hotz asked. To come to Las Vegas, I mean. Well, it was Allie, Tom replied. And whose idea was it to go to Merlin's Tower for your stay? She did. It was part of some package deal she found at an online travel agency. Tom spread his hands in a pleading gesture. Look, what does any of that have to do with... And how far in advance did she make the plans for this trip? Hotz continued. He shrugged. Not long. It was like a spur-of-the-moment thing. Uh-huh, was all Hotz said in reply. It took Tom a couple of seconds for the implication to sink in. Oh, now wait a minute, he began. It was also her idea to dine at the Lady of the Lake restaurant, wasn't it, Mr. Gaines? Oh, come on, Tom said in despair. Wasn't it? Hotz repeated. Yes, Tom replied. She thought it'd be a good place for us to talk. About what? Tom hesitated. Jesus, did these fuckers have to know everything? About what, Mr. Gaines? Hotz asked, a bit more forcefully this time. Marital problems, Tom said slowly. We only got married the day before yesterday. Ah, said Hotz. Well, congratulations. The sarcastic tone in his voice was hard to miss. And did you work them out? Yeah, Tom mumbled. I guess we did. Not that you give a shit, you fat bastard, he thought. Well, that's good to hear, Hotz said dryly. Sometimes getting through the honeymoon can be the hardest part of the marriage. He returned Tom's statement to the pile and shuffled his papers into a neat stack. Was there anything else you discussed while you were having dinner? Anything that isn't in your report? Tom sneered at him. What, now you think maybe I was in on it too? Hotz showed his own teeth. Let's get one thing straight, Mr. Gaines, he said tersely. I'm the one who asks the goddamn questions. You don't. You're the one who answers them. But I will tell you this, if you thought for a single second that the possibility you're mixed up in this only occurred to me now, while we've been talking, then you're even less intelligent than your college grade point average lets on. He smiled knowingly and patted the stack of reports in his folder. Tom pointed at the pile in shock. You've got that in there too? All that and more, Hotz replied. He looked to the female agent who turned off the camera, then turned back to Tom. We're the FBI, Mr. Gaines, he growled. I can tell you what you had for dinner a month ago Thursday, or when the last time was that you and some of your buddies tried rewiring a cable box to get a pay-per-view event you didn't want to pay for. It's all part of the shared information network that's been established with the other agencies. CIA, NSA, Department of Defense, to help combat the threat of terrorism in these here United States. He smiled broadly, maliciously. A security network designed to protect your life and the lives of every other person in this country, set up by the very government you, sir, have problems with. He paused as though suddenly reminded of something. Oh, that's right. Your problem's not with the government, just with some of the people running it. The smile widened. I imagine by now you've added me to that list, correct? Tom grunted and settled for staring back at him in stony silence, rather than answer. Besides, why bother telling the smug bastard what he obviously already knew? Hotz gestured to the female agent, and she turned the camera back on. So getting back to where we left off, Mr. Gaines, he said, all business again. Is there anything you'd like to tell me now that you didn't tell the police or include in your statement?" The false grin flashed beneath his thick mustache. "And please take your time, sir. I certainly plan to." At 1:30 that afternoon, an unmarked van containing the 5 survivors pulled away from the rear entrance of Metro Police Headquarters, bound for Merlin's Tower. For Warren, Shauna, and Plug, it was so they could retrieve their cars. Shauna also needed to find out what was going on with Magapalooza, since it had been announced on the news that the hotel was going to be closed until a veritable army of structural engineers had inspected the tower from top to bottom. Bad enough an elevator had sheared away from one side. It would be even worse if there was a possibility the entire building might collapse. For Allie and Tom, it was so they could gather up their belongings and relocate to another hotel. A less expensive, far less impressive one, since the city had offered to pick up the tab. Allie would have preferred just cutting the trip short and flying back to Illinois, but Special Agent Hodge had made it quite clear that she and her husband weren't going anywhere, yet. "Maybe I don't have enough evidence to hold you to," he'd commented earlier, "but until I see a report that states, without a shadow of a doubt, that the accident was just an accident, you are not leaving this city." Hodge hadn't planned on letting them go at all, but after Tom had loudly and frequently demanded to see a lawyer because his civil rights were being violated, the questioning had ground to a halt, and since that request had been captured on videotape and been heard by every cop in the homicide squad room, it was a little difficult to ignore. So for the time being they were free to go, although there was no doubt the FBI would have them under some kind of surveillance. The ride to the tower was supposed to be a short, uneventful trip, but as the van turned the corner of police headquarters, the Merlin Five, as the news reports referred to them, found themselves driving into the midst of a media circus. Somehow word had gotten out, no doubt through a leak in the department, and an army of reporters had set up camp on Stewart Avenue to cover the story. They swarmed around the van, Nikons flashing, video cameras recording, questions screaming to be heard, microphones being shoved at the rolled-up windows in case one of the group members had something memorable to say for the 6 o'clock news. It took a couple dozen uniformed officers to push the crowd back behind the barricades that had been set up on the street. But the enforced relocation did nothing to lower the decibel level of the questions shouted, or the number of camera lenses trained on the group. Finally, though, the sidewalk was cleared and a wide enough area for the van to make it onto the street proper, where the driver made a left-hand turn. Accompanied by sector cars in front and behind it, and state troopers riding mammoth motorcycles on both sides of it, the van rolled past the main post office and City Hall, heading for Las Vegas Boulevard. For Warren, getting past that sea of reporters was the closest he'd ever gotten to experiencing a perp walk from the criminal's point of view, and as close as he ever wanted to get. He'd been on the other side of the situation often enough during his career. So often, in fact, he pretty much considered it part of the job. It was a regular public relations event where arresting officers would walk a suspect out of the station and past the throngs of reporters to a waiting car. It was done as a courtesy of sorts, to give the press an opportunity to do exactly what they were doing to Warren and the others, scream and yell and practically trip over one another to get a good shot or a catchy soundbite. Taking that short stroll from front door to car door had never bothered Warren before, but then he tended to be the guy who led the prisoner, not the prisoner himself. And after almost 12 hours of answering questions about what had been dubbed the strip mall disaster by one of the local papers, MAUL, not MALL, a prisoner was exactly who where Warren felt like. How they all felt, actually. Shauna had been the only one to admit that to him, but it was clear from the exhausted, saddened expressions on the faces of the other 3 survivors that they probably wouldn't disagree. Getting worked over by the FBI hadn't helped lessen that feeling either. Even Warren had come to despise the apparent sadistic gusto with which Hotz tore into his witnesses, grilling Allie Gaines to the point of making her break down in tears at one point, before she eventually got her second wind and started giving him shit back. Was expected, and not beyond anything Warren himself would have done to get answers. It was when Hotz had set his sights on him that his attitude began to change, to try and bully a fellow law enforcer, a decorated officer who'd busted his ass to earn his gold detective shield, with threats about ruining his life and career, and then to imply he might have been one of Gaines's accomplices. Well, that was stepping over the goddamn line. Not that Warren hadn't been waiting for something like that to happen. 5 people jumping off an elevator seconds before it crashes was mighty suspicious looking, and he'd known the FBI would come at him, at all of them, hard. This wasn't some fender bender on the Maryland Parkway, or an altercation after a concert at the Hard Rock Cafe. Somebody had to be held accountable for all those deaths and all that property damage, and whether the cause of it was man-made or mechanical, the responsible party or parties had to be found, and fast. It was just that maybe the feds were barking up the wrong tree. As he looked at the rest of the group, it became harder to believe there could be a murderous saboteur among them, and by them he meant Plug and the Gaineses. Shauna he discounted immediately as a killer. She couldn't even stand to see animals suffering on those wildlife shows she was always watching. Hell, the sight of a little baby dinosaurs getting eaten by a bigger dinosaur on some special PBS was running last month had even made her cry. And those things were all CGI, special effects. And if she couldn't bear to watch imaginary animals dying, well, all right, maybe she wouldn't mind seeing the panther that had come at her yesterday get what it deserved, but that was understandable. Everybody had their exceptions. As for Plug, the guy looked too jittery to be a terrorist. Putting him in charge of wrecking an elevator was like asking Scooby-Doo to build an atomic bomb. It wouldn't have taken long before he accidentally dropped a monkey wrench on the core and blew himself and all of Mayberry to shit. Of course, with Plug, it could just be an act, and maybe underneath that fish-eyed loser exterior lurked a criminal mastermind capable of destroying the entire city. Or not. Warren had gotten a look at Plug's arrest record. He was about as boringly typical a bottom feeder as they came, and probably more harmful to himself than others. Although Warren now remembered he had admitted he used to do elevator maintenance, so he'd have the knowledge. Yep, he may have the knowledge required to screw with the car's mechanics. It was definitely something to keep in mind. Tom Gaines didn't seem the killing type either. No history of violent behavior, no major arrests, and from what Warren had observed in the time since the incident, it seemed pretty evident that the wife was the one in charge, which made Gaines more of a follower than a leader. She wanted to take the trip. She was the one who proposed marriage. He just shrugged and went along with it. That, to Warren, meant he was fairly easygoing, more of a thinker than a doer. But again, that could all be an act, like with Plug. It probably wasn't, though. Tom Gaines was one of those guys who went through life barely making a ripple on the surface, easily coerced into doing things because he didn't want to rock the boat. It was the kind of attitude that would make him the perfect fall guy if the situation required one. Annie Goodwin Gaines was the hard one to figure out. Crying one minute, belligerent the next. Her mood swings apparently had as many ups and downs as the roller coaster on top of the stratosphere. Her behavior had certainly kept Hotz on his toes. Another 10 minutes with her, and he would have either shot her or killed over dead from a heart attack. Nothing he'd said, no matter how threatening it was, or how loudly he yelled it, could get her to back down from her crazy premonition story. She had a strong will, that girl. Strong enough to take on an FBI agent and come out the other side still in one piece. It was almost admirable. She also had an arrest record longer than her husband's, most of the incidents involving drunk and disorderly charges. The last one had happened a few years ago, but up until then she'd apparently been quite the party girl. And then there was a brief mention he'd come across in the reports about some psychological trauma, but then he'd had to hide it when Hot stomped back into the squad room to say they were all being released. Well, it probably didn't matter. Besides, as a witness, Warren shouldn't have been allowed to see the other survivors' records or their statements, even if he was a cop. Privileged information and all that other bullshit. But what was a partner for if they didn't look out for you once in a while, right? He looked up to the van's front passenger seat where Izzy was sitting. She was on her cell phone, talking softly to someone. Maybe it was Charlie or one of their kids. She thanked the other person and closed the phone. "What's going on, Izzy?" he asked. "That was Bradstreet," she replied, one of the other detectives, who'd been sitting in Carolina Lariva's apartments, Warren remembered. "One of the sector cars thought they spotted Robert Diaz yesterday around 6 p.m., walking around New York Avenue, but he gave them the slip. They figured he ducked into one of the stores there until they'd passed." In the rearview mirror, Warren noticed Plug's head jerk in Izzy's direction, and his eyes widen. The little twitcher was sitting behind Warren and Shauna, in the last of the van's 3 rows of seats. The Gaineses were in the row ahead of them. "You got something to say, Plug?" Warren asked, still watching the reflection. Huh? Plug stuttered. No, What makes you say that, Detective?" Warren turned around in his seat to face him. "Because you started acting real nervous when my partner mentioned this guy we've been looking for. A real hard case." His eyes narrowed. "You work on New York Avenue, don't you?" "Yeah," Plug answered, nodding his head a little too much. "Big Apple Laundromat. I handle the second shift." Warren scratched his jaw in contemplation. "Second shift. That's what, 5 in the afternoon to 1 a.m.? Uh-huh, Plug said slowly. "Well, maybe you saw this guy Diaz around... What time was it, Izzy?" He spoke to his partner, but his eyes never left Plug. The rumpled loser had his full attention, and that seemed to make him even more nervous. "Around 6, Izzy replied. Warren nodded. "Around 6. So, you could have spotted him going by. Or maybe yours was even the store he ducked into when that sector cat rolled down the street?" Plug shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, but he was avoiding making any eye contact. "Maybe. A lot of people come in to do their laundry." "True," Warren agreed, "but I doubt this guy was looking to wash a bunch of clothes." "Well, okay," Plug said. "What did he look like?" "He's Mexican, about 5'10", built like a refrigeration unit," Warren replied. "Got a mustache like Pancho Villa. Uses a lot of styling mousse to keep his hair back. Has a really nasty temper, that one." Now Plug's eyes were as big as coasters. What did he do?" he croaked. Warren hesitated and glanced at Shauna. After her near miss with the panther, he hadn't been able to bring himself to start talking about his cases at dinner last night, especially the one involving Danny Lariva. But now he was stuck inside a van with her sitting right next to him, and there was no way to avoid the issue. "He's a suspect in a homicide investigation," he finally said. "Who did he kill?" Plug asked quietly. He was trembling a little. Maybe the guy needed a drink, and he was starting to go through the DTs. "I didn't say he killed anybody," Warren said. "We just want to talk to him." "But he must have had something to do with it," Plug said, "or he wouldn't have—" His voice suddenly trailed off. Son of a bitch, Warren thought. The squirrely little bastard is holding out on me. Wouldn't have what, Arlen? He demanded. Wouldn't have ducked into your store when he saw the officers? He pointed an accusatory finger at him. You saw him. I'd bet a body part on it. He did come into the laundromat, right? Yeah, Plug whispered. He coughed to clear his throat. He came in around 6, but he didn't stay long. Why was that? Izzy asked from the front. Plug stared at his hands, massaging the knuckles on his left hand with his right thumb, then repeating the action on his right hand with his left thumb, over and over again in a constant cycle. Detective Montoya asked you a question, Arlen, Warren said. She's not gonna repeat it. Hey, Allie suddenly popped in. Why don't you leave him alone? We've all been through a... Warren whipped his head around to face her. Keep your mouth shut and mind your own business, Mrs. Gaines, he warned. You've got a mountain of shit of your own to dig out of. I suggest you worry about that and not about whether I'm treating poor Mr. Plug with enough respect. She didn't seem ready to back down, though. Yeah? Well, what's so important about the guy you're looking for that you... He killed a kid, all right? Warren snapped. Allie practically jumped out of her seat, and he heard Shauna gasp beside him. Shit, he thought. Well, there you go, boy. Everything's out in the open now. Maybe killed a kid, he said in a calmer tone. That's why we need to find him. If he's innocent, then fine. He's a witness, and we have to get his statement. See what kind of leads he can provide so we can locate the killer. But if he's the one who did it, then what? Allie asked with a sneer. You catch him and he gets the death penalty? That caught him by surprise. Oh, God, he thought, with a silent groan. I'm locked up in a van with the fucking bleeding heart liberal. The victim was 10 years old, Mrs. Gaines, Izzy replied. Oh, my God, Shauna whispered. She looked to Warren. Is that what you're working on now? He nodded. I was going to tell you about it last night, but then you had that thing with the panther and... He shrugged. It just didn't seem like a good idea to talk about it over dinner. And then after that... He let his voice trail off. He didn't need to explain it any further. You didn't answer me, Detective Ackerman, Allie said. Would he get the death penalty? Christ, Warren thought. If she's so fucking psychic, can't she figure that out herself? Maybe, he replied. I don't know. That'd be up to a jury. He gestured at himself and Izzy. We just catch the bastards. We don't sentence them, ma'am. She frowned. And is that what you'd consider justice, that eye for an eye shit? Kill him because he killed a child? Not so much an eye for an eye, Mrs. Gaines, he replied and smiled wryly. I'd call it restoring the cosmic balance. And that was the point when all hell broke loose. There was no warning of impending danger, no hint that anything might be out of the ordinary. One moment the van and its police escort were motoring along Las Vegas Boulevard, past Bridger Avenue, heading south. The next, a set of traffic lights that hung over the intersection broke loose and slammed into the left side of the vehicle. The driver, a young cop named Sean Murphy, who'd introduced himself to the group back at the police station, died on impact, right before Allie's eyes, in a shower of blood and broken metal and shattered glass. The edge of the foremost metal signal cut right through his door and windshield, and right through him. He didn't even have time to scream, but Allie did, as his torso bounced off the ceiling of the van, then onto Detective Montoya's lap. Blood sprayed everywhere, and Allie let go an unholy screech as it splashed hotly across her face. She wasn't the only one screaming, of course. It was just that hers were the loudest, at least to her own ears. The van careened out of control, swerving to the right then to the left, where a cry of surprise was cut short by a horrible thump, followed by an awful-sounding crash. Allie remembered the motorcycle cop who'd been riding alongside as part of the procession. It sounded like he'd been sideswiped by the van. God, I hope he's okay, she thought. The vehicle continued across the boulevard to bounce off 3 or 4 other vehicles. Allie couldn't tell how many, not being able to see before roaring back into the southbound lanes. Allie felt every collision as she frantically wiped at her face with her bare hands. Part of her grateful that Murphy had insisted she wear her seatbelt. Part of her wondering what had possessed her to wear a sleeveless dress to dinner last night. Clearing the blood that covered her eyelids, Allie was able to see Montoya slumped in her seat, either unconscious or dead. Murphy, whose arms had wrapped around her neck in a macabre embrace, looked about as shocked as Allie felt, his eyes wide with apparent disbelief that he could have died in such a bizarre manner. As the van swerved again, Allie looked to the steering wheel. Jesus Christ, she thought, there's nobody driving this thing. Instinctively, she looked to Tom, who was sitting directly behind the driver's seat, to see if he could help. But her husband was sitting motionless, and blood was seeping down along the left side of his face from a nasty gash across the temple. He'd been struck by something when the traffic lights hit that side of the van, and for a second she thought he was dead. "Tom!" she said. "Tom!" She shook him, and he moaned. Allie breathed a sigh of relief. "Oh, thank God," she whispered. He'd be all right, she was certain. The van lurched again. With no other options available, Allie scrambled to unbuckle her seat belt, but the damn thing wouldn't come loose, like it was stuck all of a sudden. She yanked at the restraining strap, clawed at the release mechanism, but nothing worked. It was as though the belt was fighting her efforts to stop the van from crashing. She glanced up to see where the vehicle was heading, and then her gaze fell on something that her panicked mind found hard to register. The bottom half of Murphy's body, the legs and buttocks, was still in the driver's seat, and as she watched, the right foot pressed down on the gas pedal. "Oh my God!" she screamed as the van picked up speed. It rammed into the rear of the police car that was leading the motorcade, the impact sending Allie and the other survivors jolting forward. Allie held her breath as the seatbelt tightened across her chest, forcing the air from her lungs finally. Then she was slapped back against the seat as the van swerved around the police cruiser and accelerated. It tore down Las Vegas Boulevard, weaving in and out of traffic, like it knew where it wanted to go. Allie frantically tore at the seatbelt, pulling it, stretching it, even trying at one point to slide out from under it. "Oh God, we're going to die!" Shauna cried from behind her. Allie turned around. The girl's face was covered with blood, although it was impossible to tell if it was her own or just more of Murphy's arterial spray. She looked a little dazed, but not enough that she couldn't recognize the danger they were all in. Beside her, Ackerman was just starting to come around from whatever knock to the head he'd taken. Allie reached over the seat to shake him. "Detective Ackerman, wake up!" A siren blared outside her window. Allie turned to see the remaining motorcycle cop trying to keep pace with the speeding van. She was suddenly struck with the notion that he probably thought they'd commandeered the vehicle and were trying to make some sort of getaway. She pounded on the window. "Help us!" she yelled. Before the state trooper could respond, the van jerked to the right and clipped the front tire of his motorcycle. The bike went spinning out of control and slammed into a parked car. Allie had just enough time to see the cop go flying over the roof of the car before the van crossed the next intersection. Drivers and other vehicles stomped on their brakes and swerved out of the way as the van cut across the lanes of traffic. The siren stopped. Where the hell is it taking us? Allie wondered. Back to the hotel to finish the job? Ackerman groaned and Allie shifted around to face him. "Detective Ackerman!" Shauna reached across the seat to shake him. Warren! His eyes opened. "Jesus, honey, I'm not deaf." Then he sat bolt upright as the van lurched. "Hey, what's the goddamn rush?" "There's nobody driving the van!" Allie screamed. That took a precious second or two to get through his muddled brain. But then he fully came around. He looked at the driver's seat, at what remained of the driver, muttered a terse, "Holy shit!" then looked to Detective Montoya. "Izzy!" he yelled. "I think she's unconscious," Allie explained. "Or she's..." "Then why aren't you stopping this fucking thing?" he demanded. She pointed toward her lap. "Because I can't get the goddamn buckle to open." You might want to try a little harder," Plug said, and pointed toward the front of the van. Allie turned around to look at what had gotten his attention. A block ahead of them was the intersection where the Strip and Charleston Boulevard met, and stretched right across the middle of it, in the process of making a left-hand turn onto the boulevard's northbound lanes, was a 16-wheeled gas tanker, no doubt filled to the brim with gallon upon gallon of highly flammable fuel. "Well, I didn't see that coming," Allie said. She started pounding on the seatbelt release, like that would do anything to make it open. But then Ackerman grabbed her left shoulder and pushed her to the side toward Tom. "Cover your ears," he ordered. She turned in time to see him lean over her seat with a gun in his hand. "Jesus Christ!" she cried. "What the hell are you doing?" "Cutting you loose," he answered. "You think I carry a fucking Swiss Army knife? Now cover your goddamn ears!" Allie did as she was told, but it didn't do her hearing much good. The gun roared once, momentarily deafening her, and her nostrils filled with acrid smoke. When she looked down, there was a gaping hole in the seatbelt strap and in the seat itself. Ackerman grabbed the material with both hands and started yanking hard on it, trying to tear apart the remaining section of the belt. Allie helped as best she could in her awkward sitting position, and they were rewarded with the sound of the strap beginning to break. The van suddenly accelerated as though whatever force was guiding it knew what they were up to, and now it was a race to see who was going to come out of it the winner. With the final tear of reinforced fabric, the seatbelt came loose, and Allie dived for the steering wheel. But no matter how hard she tried turning it, the wheel would not budge. The van was locked on its collision course. She gave up on trying to steer and scrambled to gain control of the brake pedal. She reached down with both hands and grabbed Murphy's right leg by the ankle, then tried yanking it off the accelerator. But the leg muscles were frozen like rigor mortis had set in, and the foot was still pressing down on the pedal. "You know, if you're gonna do something," Plug commented in a surreally calm voice, "this would be a really good time for it." "I'm trying, goddammit!" Allie snapped. She looked up from her efforts to glance out through the shattered windshield. The side of the tanker filled her vision. She looked away from the looming disaster and focused on the job at hand. Putting all her strength into it, she pulled back on the leg and succeeded in sliding it off the gas. Then, with a scream born of desperation and fear, she picked it up and slammed it down on the brake. The van rolled to a hard stop. Allie looked up as the hood of the vehicle lightly bumped against the wall of the tanker. Then she grabbed the keys on the steering column, switched off the ignition, and killed the van's engine. "Thank you, God," Shauna whispered from the back. Allie released her grip on Murphy's leg, not wanting to touch parts of a dead guy anymore. But then a loud sloshing sound beneath and around her caught her attention, and she looked down. The top half of Murphy's severed torso, the part that had Detective Montoya locked in a death embrace, had spilled his guts onto the floor. And now, Allie found herself crouching in a pile of colons and liver and pancreas and stomach. She was in the process of shrieking when last night's dinner decided to take advantage of her wide-open mouth and evacuate her stomach, spewing what seemed like a never-ending, acidic-tasting torrent of catfish and chocolate and imported beer across the driver's seat, the steering wheel, and the dashboard. The noxious mixture slid down the black-colored upholstery to the floor, where it mixed with the intestinal juices congealing around her hands and knees in a ghastly stew. The strength drained out of her right then and there, and Allie numbly belched, a mucus bubble containing tiny bits of fish momentarily forming on her lips before silently popping. "Oh, God," she muttered. Beside her she heard Tom groan. She looked up to find him touching the left side of his head, then gazing at the blood he found on his fingers, clearly at a loss to understand how it could have gotten there. He turned to stare at her with that sort of dumb, confused expression that comes over someone when they wake up and sense that they have just missed out on something. "Hey, honey," he said dully, "you look like shit." She would have laughed, but then some undigested part of yesterday's lunch unexpectedly forced its way up her gullet. Before she could turn her head, the projectile vomiting had recommenced, turning the crotch and right leg of Tom's dress slacks a grotesque shade of yellow-green. "That makes two of us," Allie said with a weak grin, and belched again. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Chapter 14 of Final Destination, Dead Man's Hand. I gotta say, I enjoyed tonight's upload. This was a very well-balanced chapter. It had some good character and story development, and then, just out of nowhere, all hell broke loose, and we had a lot of action in the second half of the chapter. I will say I did enjoy the interrogation scenes. I'm glad that they're sticking with that, because in a realistic situation, that would be, there would be suspicion, and that sort of thing would go down. But, yeah, guys, what did y'all think of the interrogation, and then when all hell broke loose and it seemed like this van was driving itself towards that tanker, trying to take them all out at once? Because that's not something you see a lot in the Final Destination movies. Once they get away, once they cheat death, he comes after them one at a time. But they would have all died all at once, and death would have been able to clear them all off the board in one fell swoop. But that's not what happened. They were able to cheat death yet again. And, the only thing I could have went without tonight was all the projectile vomiting and the description of what was coming out of her at the end, because that just seemed like too much information, a little TMI in FDDMH tonight. But that's my opinion on tonight's chapter, and as boring as some of the book was in the beginning, in the first 200 pages, with all that character development and backstory, I gotta say, I'm really enjoying the book, and having all that backstory is actually paying off now, because it makes these scenes matter more, and when something funny is said, you actually laugh with the character, because you know the character. It's not just some random person. So let me know what you guys think in the comments section below, and I'll be back very soon with more of this book. We're winding down to the last 100 pages or so, so this book is almost done, guys. Just want to say thank you to the people who brought you tonight's upload, and that would be our patrons over on the Patreon page: Carl Eakins, Catherine McClear, Sean Campbell, and Cecilia Spears. And if you would like to sponsor the channel and help keep the channel going and get a lot of awesome rewards for doing so, for as little as $5 a month, go to the link in the description below to the Patreon page and sign up. You'll be doing a great service to the channel. I will really appreciate it, and it will help the channel keep growing and going for years to come. Alright guys, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and as always,
I'll see you soon.